So Ben, this episode will concentrate specifically on the Baptist's head and this tradition of representing not the entire narrative of the martyrdom of John the Baptist. So in the earlier tradition, visual traditions, we often have the representation of the imprisonment, the banquet of Herod, the dance of Salome, and then finally the beheading. And here, particularly in the Baroque period, we see it pared back, stripped back to the essentials of the narrative. So here, as you can see in our Caravaggio, we have just Salome, the executioner, and one witness, maidservant perhaps, with the salver and the presentation, let's say, of the head.
It's hugely concentrated and emotionally very concentrated too. The impact of the image when it reaches this stage is huge.
And the figures are life-size. And in that projection of that strong arm of the executioner, the head of John the Baptist is being thrust forward into our space and making us very uncomfortable as beholders standing in front of this picture.
Yes, you can't sort of feel entirely relaxed in front of this picture. And the curious way in which the Baptist's mouth lolls open, again, has a very sort of visceral effect. As well as reminding us of the fact that the Baptist was once a preacher, the one whose voice cried out in the wilderness, and still that sort of echo of the open mouth is very powerful.
And part of that visceral effect, I think, is the way that Salome's holding that platter, slightly tilted, and you can just make out the pooling of the blood as she's about to accept that head, and it's really feeling like it's projecting into our space. And then again, there's some sort of ambiguity, I think, in the responses of the figures. To me, the executioner seems quite resigned, but he's just doing a job as well. And interestingly, Caravaggio, a master of cropping, has cropped his composition in such a way that the executioner rests his hand on the hilt of the sword, and it's cropped in such a way that it forms a cross.
It calls to mind, although a much later painting, the Puvis de Chavannes we saw in our last episode, where the head of the Baptist is turned towards the cross. And here, in Caravaggio's much earlier work, we see the same conjunction of Baptist's head and something that evokes the cross.
And also to read the face of Salome looking out of the picture, but not out at the beholder, not in a confrontational way, which you see in some traditions, but slightly forlornly out to the side.
Not callous. Not rejoicing.
No, not smug or self-satisfied either. Somewhere in between. And the only real figure who seems to be lamenting this fact is the older woman in the background, and you can see her hands are folded in prayer. She's resting her chin on them in a kind of silent, contemplative way, perhaps in the way that we might approach a relic.
The way you've described the reducing down of the narrative, which we see here, reminds me that there can be an even further reduction just to focus on the head and the platter with everyone else removed from the scene, and that this was a very popular artistic and devotional tradition. For example, in late medieval England, large numbers of alabaster sculptures of the head of the Baptist on a plate were made for people's homes. It must have been a kind of shorthand for people, reminding them of the whole story, reminding them of relics of the Baptist, and a way to have something constantly present in their day-to-day lives that reminded them of him and his importance.
And that idea of that devotional focus in the home as a constant reminder is quite interesting, because that continues right into the later modern and even contemporary traditions, because there is a fantastic artist called Ana Maria Pacheco, and she's actually sculpted a wooden polychrome sculpture of John the Baptist's head, which she's placed on a salver, and it is actually kept by the collector in his house on his coffee table. I'll have to show you what I mean. Ben, the owner of the head of John the Baptist, carved by the Brazilian sculptor Ana Maria Pacheco, has kindly agreed to let us come see it. And it occurred to me that we should invite the artist herself. So she's actually going to be meeting us at the house.
Fantastic.
And there's plenty of questions we might have for her. Well, Anna, thank you so much for agreeing to...
Oh, no, don't mention it.
Talk about this sculpture today. I was just asking Ben if he'd seen it before, and this is your first time.
I've seen photographs, but there's a completely different experience when you feel in the presence of...
I know, but I suppose this is the thing about sculpture, particularly this kind of sculpture, because it is figurative. And since I came to England, I started to recall my experience as a child visiting churches, and most have Baroque sculptures and what comes with it behind the culture. Hence, the fact that I use the nails is because also, not that the church would have that for obvious reasons, but there was, particularly in Brazil, more than any other country in Latin America, the influence of African sculpture, because we took probably the biggest number of slaves. And so this was so much part of the visual experience. So I wanted to use the nails there to complete the notion of the hair, but gives a hint of the crucifixion as well.
Yeah.
But
So-
I noticed you've got very thick nails here sticking out. Like
Yes.
spikes. But there's
It's
very
the tiny
small,
little ones,
tiny
yes.
little.
Yes.
You just make out the heads of the nails in the beard as well,
Yeah,
which also
yeah.
give it that texture.
Exactly.
Well, you were just talking about the physicality of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
That is of the sculpture,
Yes.
but also in making it, it's quite a physical
Yes,
bit of work.
that's
Can you sort
not
of
so
tell
big.
us about?
Yes, I
what is that
normally,
process?
this is actually quite small considering the other ones I do. The
Still bigger than life size.
Oh,
now
yes.
when you see it, I mean,
But
yes.
I use chainsaw. My reason to use the chainsaw is because I couldn't do like they did in the 18th century, or even before, the kind of very detailed hair, because it wouldn't ring true, because we have gone far away from it.
And you're not trying to recreate
No,
a Renaissance
it's not. Far
sculpture.
from it.
Yes.
I came to this, took us some time to come to this solution, because by cutting, it's too rigid. So I came to this idea of burning it. So I burn it.
With a blowtorch.
Blowtorch, yeah.
And is that just in the hair?
Yeah.
Because you can
and
sort of see it softens the edges,
yes,
doesn't
yes, it does, and also the cut becomes less rigid, so you can play with that. So that is the whole thing about the making. You have to discover solutions that convey and are tied up with the narrative.
I just
Exactly,
was
very
struck by
important.
that because the chainsaw is a modern equivalent of the axe, which
Yeah.
we've talked about being almost a symbol of the Baptist, because he talks about trees being cut down and judged as a sort of a symbol of judgment.
Yeah.
But of course, also as an executioner's
Oh, yeah.
implement, we've looked at executioner's swords, and that act of cutting.
Yes, this idea.
Yeah.
And
Are you interested in that continuity? Or I mean, obviously,
Yes, of course.
unfortunately, beheadings still take place.
Oh
and
yeah,
that's
but you see, that is why when people say, "Oh, but this work is not dealing with contemporaries," you not quite, it's still, but I think it does help if you refer to some events that did happen such a long time ago. I think it's because it's still there. But you are detached enough, it won't be just an illustration of because of sedimentation of history in that particular subject. I think is more interesting for that reason. The thing about why did I choose John the Baptist was this idea of someone who do not accept the status quo and fought to the fact to the end
interesting.
to that.
He is a man with bite.
Yeah,
He's a man-
yeah, that's a
and,
good one.
You know, and that's why Herod
the
is
mouse,
so
no? Yeah.
disturbed
Yeah,
by him, and why he has to be got rid of. And
yeah, but
his revolutionary nature has a terrible end.
well, he's always remembered in the best of what he preached for, and the idea, the visionary thing of the change of an order. What happened with revolutionaries, and that is why probably I chosen that particular moment, because to me that is the statement, if one wants to say, with the work, is this idea that revolutionaries should never stay, but they always do.
They give their message and then they should.
Yeah, well, because they do, because they are arrogant, and power corrupts. I mean, the cliche, but it's true.
John, lying open-mouthed here, spoke, and the mouth was so important, he spoke the truth to power.
Yeah.
He didn't ever take power,
No.
and that gives him a very
Yeah, and I
special-
think that's why it's my interest ultimately in that figure is probably for that reason.